Part 2, Halfbreed Resistance to Imperialism. 6. The Halfbreed Nation and the Civil War. Halfbreeds became a recognized separate racial group on the prairies during the last half of the 18th century. French, English, and Scottish fur traders had mingled with the Indian population, and from these relationships sprang a race of people distinct from both white and Indian society. In some cases, the fathers married the Indian women and established residence in Indian neighborhoods. However, in these early relationships, most fathers returned to white society, leaving the children to grow up in a native environment with their mothers. After 1760, the half-breed communities began to evolve into a distinguishable society. To a large extent, the development of this Métis society coincides with the period of conflict between the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company, 1768 to 1821. The numerous trading posts established by these trading companies became centers of half-breed population. In the early days, half-breeds followed a hunting and trapping way of life, similar to that of the Indians. Gradually, they settled down to a more sedentary life, while retaining some of their hunting ways. Many farmed the fertile grounds around the Red and Assiniboine rivers in Manitoba, which was also an important trading center for the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company on the main path of company trade routes. Furs gathered by Indians and half-breeds were brought to the Red River forts and exchanged for European goods, and Red River soon became the unofficial headquarters of the half-breed population. Many descendants of the clerks in the forts were inclined to live close to the trading posts, and clerks were inclined to favor their offspring whenever jobs were available for native workers. But since many fort authorities held these people in contempt, racial bitterness prevailed. The Red River area was the focal point of the struggle between the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company. Since all the trade of the Northwest Company was channeled through this site, the Hudson's Bay Company decided to block it by bringing in a large colony of Scottish immigrants to settle the area. The land grant for this settlement was a free grant by the Hudson's Bay Company to Lord Selkirk, and the colony was intended to serve several purposes. The new settlers could act as militia for the bay. Private ownership of the land would interfere with the Northwest Company fur traders, and the supply of pemmican for these traders would be checked. With this plan in mind, several hundred settlers were brought to Red River over a period of time beginning in 1812 under the direction of Lord Selkirk, a high official in the Hudson's Bay Company. To defend his settlement, Selkirk later recruited a regiment of Swiss troops and stationed them in Red River. The colony immediately struck at the heart of the Northwest Company's fur trade, and it was virtually a declaration of war. Immediately upon their arrival, the settlers came into conflict with the Indians and half-breeds, because the Hudson's Bay Company took this land of 116,000 square miles as its exclusive property and denied others hunting and trapping rights. In the decade preceding 1821, a war raged between these two fur trading giants. Unhappily, in the interval, the rivalries between the two camps on the Red River became inflamed to the point that, in order to unleash a bloody brawl, nothing other was needed than that one side should provoke the other sufficiently. While the soldiers Lord Selkirk thought would be useful in the Red River area were being mustered, he gave way to a bad impulse and wrote to Governor Colin Robertson telling him that, come what may, he must expel the rival company. Robertson needed no instruction to act violently. This was in the spring of 1816. In the preceding year, 4 Hudson's Bay employees had been killed in a skirmish when the Northwest Company took Fort Douglas. Robertson wanted revenge. The result of Robertson's vengeance was the Seven Oaks Massacre, mistakenly attributed in the history books to Métis savagery. The long struggle inevitably involved most of the natives in the Red River area. It was important to them insofar as it promoted the development of half-breed nationalism, largely because the company solicited half-breed support for military purposes. These appeals gave the half-breeds a strong awareness of their own power as a separate race and nation. The Northwest Company was more successful in obtaining half-breed support since the Métis had legitimate grievances against the Bay colonists who had taken their lands. After the union of the two companies in 1821, the Hudson's Bay Company immediately began its revenge against the half-breeds and Indians. Bay governors imposed even more severe restrictions and oppressive conditions on the native population than formerly. The renewed monopoly market kept many natives in perpetual debt to the Bay, psychologically as well as economically. The Bay imposed its debt dependency system deliberately on the native trappers, furs. An important witness, Alan MacDonald, declared that the company's system was designed to destroy any capability the Indian might possess of emancipating himself from the bondage of an avaricious group of trading monopolists. He described how Indians who attempted to work at another occupation than fur trading were harassed by the company. The object, MacDonald said, was to prevent the Indians learning that there was another pursuit whereby they could become independent of the company and cease to be its hunters. Restrictive conditions were imposed on the native people. For instance, trading or selling of furs between native people was strictly forbidden, and it was even against Bay law for a native to make a gift of fur to a friend. The Hudson's Bay Company even prevented Indians from trading with Indians, or making presents of furs to one another, or wearing furs, and tried to use missionaries to tell the Indians that the anger of God would follow wearing a foxskin. After 1821, it became standard practice for Hudson's Bay clerks to break into native trappers' homes with the assistance of Bay police and search for furs held for private use. If any were found, they were seized immediately, without payment, and never returned. On one of these Bay's searches, a trapper, after having his goods seized, had his house burned to the ground, and afterwards was conveyed prisoner to York Factory. The Bay's policy extended to whites as well. Armed constables received orders to search houses suspected of concealing furs bought from Indians. In the execution of their duty, these men committed many revolting acts. Constables went so far as to burn the house and destroy the traps of 2 French Canadians at Lake Manitoba. One of them was blind. For a like offense, a tinsmith of Italian origin was imprisoned and then deported. Now that the Bay had absolute power, it became increasingly tyrannical in its endeavor to make even greater profits. White hunters could neither sell their pelts to foreigners nor take them out to the country to sell them. It was the company that set the prices everywhere, and it goes without saying that the hunters' profits were slim. However, they were greater than those of the Indians, who were cheated unmercifully. For example, an Indian would receive only 1 shilling for a skin, where a white would receive 20 shillings. A gun that sold in England for $4.50 was sold to Indians and half-breeds for 5 silver fox skins, a value of $250. Cotton checkered men's shirts were sold for 7 beaver pelts, a profit of over 2,000%. However, some historians argued that paying higher prices to natives for furs would not have encouraged them to trap more. A rise in prices would lead to the Indians bringing down less furs, not more, because the Indians did not react to the ordinary European notions of property, nor to the normal European economic motives. This is probably true. If the Indians had fully adopted the profit motive, they might have forced the company to pay higher prices. As it was, they had no ideological incentive to do so, and were doubly vulnerable to exploitation. Bay traders also made great use of alcohol, particularly rum, to exploit natives even further, and, in spite of resistance by half-breeds and Indians, Bay officials continued to give themselves greater powers for enforcing the law in the Northwest Territories. As a result of the Bay's exploitative practices, native people became increasingly aware of their persecution and more united against it. Half-breeds, who made up 2/3 of the population, began to demand that the Bay be accountable to them and that they have some voice in the administration of the Northwest. In 1845, half-breed leaders demanded relaxed fur trading policies, but company authorities refused to make any concessions. 4 years later, native people felt that they were strong enough to take a stand against the Bay. When a young Métis was charged for trading without company permission, the half-breeds organized a protest and demanded the charges be dropped. The whole question was brought to a head in 1849, when Guillaume Soyer were arrested and imprisoned for trafficking in furs. Although convicted, Soyer was merely dismissed with an admonition in view of the hostile manifestations of the Métis. 300 of them, led by the fiery Louis Riel Père and armed with rifles and buffalo guns, surrounded the courthouse. The Métis hailed the decision as a virtual victory for their cause. At the same time, they issued a manifesto of civil rights demanding that free trade be allowed at Red River, that half-breeds be represented on the local council, and that court proceedings against French half-breeds be conducted in French. The power of the half-breed nation became recognized for the first time in 1849, not only by themselves, but by the Hudson's Bay Company as well. Colonial struggles were taking place throughout Western Canada in the 1860s. At the base of the trouble was the conflict between two different economic systems, the old economic system represented by the Hudson's Bay Company and the new industrial system. This new ruling class of British financiers and Canadian industrialists had consolidated its position in eastern Canada and was now extending its empire westward across the prairies. They wanted not only the land and the resources of the Northwest, but also a capitalist order that would consolidate and further their economic enterprises. So it was natural that they encountered opposition from the old order of the Hudson's Bay Company. The clash of these two economic systems fueled the hostilities of 1869 to 1870 in the Northwest, which resulted in Rupert's Land being brought under the constitutional authority of the government in Canada, the seat of the industrial empire. Although Native people were involved in the struggle and represented a major force against advancing imperialism, it was basically a civil war between two economic orders. The new capitalist order had to overthrow the political institutions of the old order before it could develop its new society. Up to 1869, the government and judicial system of the Northwest Territories was under the jurisdiction of the Hudson's Bay Company. The government bought the Rupert's Land Charter in 1869 in the hope that it could simply transfer power from one set of rulers to another without consulting the people of the land or the Canadian factors of the bay, the lower rank of rulers in the company. The most important proposed change was the surrender of the Hudson's Bay Company's constitutional authority over Rupert's Land, which would bring the entire Northwest under the jurisdiction of Ottawa. Since the top ruling class of the bay had become members of the new industrialist class, certain wealthy shareholders of the Hudson's Bay Company, among them Donald A. Smith, had transferred some of their capital to the impending transcontinental railways. Ottawa expected a peaceful subjugation of the Bay Empire and a willing surrender of the Northwest Territories, but Ottawa underestimated the strength of the factors within the Hudson's Bay Company because they had no share in the £300,000 paid by the government to the Bay, and because their wealth and power was derived from the day-to-day fur trading operations of the company. The factors opposed the transfer of Rupert's Land. According to most Canadian scholars and journalists, the resulting civil war was a rebellion by the Métis of Red River. Portraying it as a rebellion distorts the objective conditions and consequences of this struggle, justifies imperialist conquest, and at the same time falsifies the heritage of Native people. The struggle of 1869 was not a rebellion, because it was not an uprising against a constitutional government in existence at the time. Ottawa took over Rupert's Land under the following conditions. The Hudson's Bay Company received £300,000, $1,500,000 in cash. It was also allowed to retain the land, an area of 50,000 acres around the various trade posts, and, in addition, 2 sections in every township, making a reservation of 1/20th of the entire region in the Fertile Belt from the Red River to the Rocky Mountains. From this cash payment and land grant, the company consented to surrender its trade monopoly and all its claims. However, in 1869, the Canadian government did not yet have constitutional authority to rule over the Northwest Territories, even though the Hudson's Bay Company had agreed to surrender the land. British investors and Ottawa industrialists and politicians such as John A. Macdonald, William McDougall, and Donald Smith stood for the annexation of the Northwest Territories because they needed this vast area of land to expand their industrial empire. These people, many of them former directors of the Hudson's Bay Company, recognized where the new wealth and power resided. At the same time, they became a privileged group of investors in the Canadian Pacific Railway, CPR, as well as influential members of the Macdonald government. We have seen from Macdonald's own testimony how the Prime Minister recommended Mr. Smith for a place on the board of directors of the Canadian Pacific Railway. The top directors simply transferred their wealth and power from feudalist to industrialist enterprises, and consequently they wanted the land for industrial and agricultural purposes, not for trapping. Ottawa's plan to annex Rupert's Land gave no real power to local residents, no guarantees to the natives of their civil rights or land titles, and was to be imposed on the populace by troops. The local people strongly objected to the arbitrary seizure of their land and homes and the fact that they had not been consulted on the transfer. There were cries of dictatorship and tyranny. The newly appointed governor, William McDougall, who expected personal wealth from the transfer, saw himself in the traditional role of a British governor, riding into a colony with all the pomp and ceremony of a nabob, while the natives showed their humility and subservience. It must have been a shock to McDougall when he was met outside of the colony by Ambroise Lépine, a native native warrior with a gun in his hand and an order to stay out of Red River. The opposing force of Hudson's Bay Company factors hid behind the native forces and concealed their official position. Some Canadian factors, particularly William McTavish, who was also the governor of the local council of Assiniboia, set up the Hudson's Bay Company to administer what was later southern Manitoba, pretended support for the federal government, while in fact actively opposing Ottawa. McTavish was still a major shareholder and an official in the reorganized company, but because of the promises made in the transfer negotiations and the dual position of previous senior Bay shareholders, such as Donald A. Smith, he could not openly advocate war against Ottawa. As a result, McTavish had to play a cunning role, feigning support for Ottawa publicly, and at the same time busily organizing resistance forces behind the scenes. W.B. Odenoguk, one of the leaders in the Civil War, claimed that the insurrection was advised by Governor William McTavish, who, with other officers of the Hudson's Bay Company, also aided and abetted it from its inception to the very hour it ceased to exist. To prevent Ottawa from taking over, McTavish had to align himself with the Halfbreeds, but he tried to push native resistance to the front so it would appear that they were the main agitators. In this way, he could easily deny association with the Métis if they failed. However, he was careful not to lend them extensive support, so that if they were victorious, he could quickly subjugate them. McTavish therefore played a crafty war game in 1869 to 1870. McTavish suggested to Riel that he occupy the fort, at the same time sending McDougall words of encouragement to the effect that Riel had told him nothing as all about his intention. To seize the fort. However, the Métis were suspicious of the Hudson's Bay officials and did not want to ally themselves completely with the Bay's struggles. Although they had common aims and there was some cooperation and communication between the two forces, each operated relatively independently. The native movement differed from the Hudson's Bay's actions because it involved masses of local people and was, therefore, a democratic political movement. When the Bay Charter was sold to the federal government, the Métis saw an opportunity to break free from Hudson's Bay rule and establish a democratic government in the Northwest. Because these people had dwelt for some time on the fringe of white society, they had some skills in white government and politics and, together with the Indian nation, represented a large political force. In 1869, the population of Red River included 10,000 half-breeds, 6,000 of whom were French, and 4,000 English and Scottish half-breeds. There were also more than 1,000 Indians living in the surrounding neighborhood of Red River. The white population at that time was only 1,500. By 1869, half-breeds had become politically conscious and concerned about self-sufficiency. They felt the Red River people should have control over their own land and resources. They did not give serious support to the Council of Assiniboia because it was appointed by the Hudson's Bay, and, as the power of the local people developed, the council's power diminished. Worried about its declining position, the council attempted to assert its authority in October 1869 by calling in the Métis National Committee and asking for an explanation of its political activities. The Métis claimed that it had become necessary to organize themselves politically because there had been no recognized government in the Northwest since the Hudson's Bay had sold Rupert's Land in the summer of 1869. As a result, Governor McTavish had declared himself stripped of his authority. In this way, the country found itself with no established authority other than that of the Métis. The Métis National Committee organized the French half-breeds for resistance against Ottawa and prevented McDougall, the newly appointed governor, from entering Assiniboia. The half-breed people were not opposed to joining Confederation, providing they would be assured of title to their homes and land and given their democratic rights. They were, however, concerned about the Ottawa Bay deal in this regard because negotiations had gone on for several years without a single consultation with local people, so they had decided to oppose all attempts by Ottawa to take over their country. On 6 December 1869, the Native People's Militia took control of the entire area of Fort Garry, including the fort and Governor McTavish's residence. 2 days later, they issued a Declaration of the People of Rupert's Land and the Northwest. It stated that 1. When people have no government, they are free to adopt one form form of government in preference to another, to give or refuse allegiance to what is proposed. 2. The Hudson's Bay Company, having abandoned the people without their consent to a foreign power, the people are free to establish a provisional government and hold it to be the only and lawful authority now in existence in Rupert's Land and the Northwest, which claims the obedience and respect of the people. 3. The provisional government would enter into such negotiations with the Canadian government as may be favorable for the good government and prosperity of this people. The main points were responsible local government, legal rights, and control of resources, including land. The objectives and actions of the half-breeds showed that they were advancing on a systematic and responsible political course. After McDougall had been prevented from entering Red River, he drew upon a proclamation condemning the Métis and MacTavish. He slipped across the international boundary during the night of 30 November and nailed the document to a fence post. As far as he was concerned, he had taken possession of the Northwest on paper. McDougall then appointed Colonel J.S. Dennis, a government land surveyor in Red River, as lieutenant governor and preserver of the peace in the vast expanse of the Northwest Territories. He authorized this preserver of the peace to attack Métis, to fire on them, to drive them by force from their homes and fortified places, and to seize all the flocks, cattle, horses, sleighs, and other Métis vehicles. Under Dennis's implicit sanction, a small group of extremist Orangemen from Ontario engaged in clandestine and undemocratic activities against the Métis. They were interested in the colony partly because of the fortunes they expected to make when Ottawa took over. Their leading spokesman was the notorious Dr. J.C. Schultz, a physician from Kingston, Ontario. A principal agitator in this group was Thomas Scott, who tried to stage a coup d'etat in order to get McDougall into the colony. They unexpectedly did a great deal to advance the struggle of the Red River people, most of whom despised the Orangemen and joined together against the common enemy. Because the Orangemen and their allies supported the federal government, the Northwest people began to consider carefully what kind of government existed in Ottawa and how it would operate in the Northwest. Following these incidents, the people under the direction of Louis Riel moved towards a provisional government on 25 January 1870, with John Bruce, a Scottish half-breed, as president. Their purpose was to get a guarantee from Ottawa for the protection of their rights before administrative control of the Northwest was constitutionally transferred to Ottawa. Most of Schultz's gang had been imprisoned by January, but were released once the provisional government was assured of support from the whole settlement. However, they continued to harass the Red River people. By attacking the French half-breeds, they hoped to gain support from the English population at the settlement. On 3rd March 1870, Thomas Scott was brought before the Council of War at Fort Garry. His history in Red River had been one of violence and crime. He had been found guilty of robbery and violent assault and had been sentenced to prison. As an Orangeman and passionate racist, he had been involved in intrigues to foster hatred among the population of Red River, and he had instigated a plot for the murder of Riel. Scott had been imprisoned twice in Fort Garry under the authority of the provisional government, and had escaped once by overpowering and beating the guards, at the same time attempting to incite other inmates to do the same. This time, he was charged with having taken up arms against the government and with assaulting a guard. He was tried by a jury of 7 men and was allowed to call witnesses to defend himself. The jury, composed of local residents, found Scott guilty of his crimes and sentenced him to execution. Contrary to the propaganda of the federal government at the time, Louis Riel had nothing to do with his conviction. Riel gave evidence as a witness and in fact pleaded that leniency be shown to the accused. Although Scott's execution was a legal action of the provisional government, Ottawa used it as a pretext to generate a racist hatred against the Métis and the provisional government. Some historians still claim that Scott was harmless, but those alive at the time have unanimously condemned him. I now repeat that Scott deserved his fate, and I defy any living man who has positively known what sort of desperate character Scott was to conscientiously put forward the argument that his death was not a measure of public safety. An aspect of the Civil War that greatly concerned Prime Minister John A. Macdonald and other ruling authorities was the possibility that the United States might annex the Northwest. Meanwhile, spurred by reports from Stutzman and scholarly analyses of them by Taylor, annexation fever was mounting daily in St. Paul and on the frontier, and Washington was eagerly watching developments. The American Congress had already discussed the question of whether this loosely held British territory should be annexed. It was recalled that President Johnson publicly, in a message to Congress, had approved annexation of the British Northwest. In 1869, the Minnesota State Legislature had sent a resolution to the United States Senate in which it declared that it was anxious for the annexation of this Northwest colony. In actual fact, the provisional government officials were in close communication and on friendly terms with American authorities. They were giving serious attention to the question of joining the United States. Ottawa was in a difficult position. Although they ultimately wanted complete control of Red River, they were afraid to send in a military force because the provisional government could immediately appeal to America for support. Time was crucial. The United States was in an advantageous position close to the colony and was able to send in supplies and troops easily. Ottawa therefore decided to withhold all serious action and resorted to a pretense of negotiations with the provisional government. The emissaries from Ottawa who visited Red River during the winter of 1869 to 1870, including Donald A. Smith, were surprised to find that the provisional government had the support of the people. John A. Macdonald and Donald Smith obviously thought of Northwest politics in terms of money talks, because Smith took with him to Fort Garry money to buy off the provisional government leaders. So Donald Smith, intrigued, spent £500 bribing whom he could, and on January 18th to 19th spoke, together with Riel, to a 2-day mass meeting of the settlers. After being in the colony for only a short time, Smith apparently decided against attempting to buy off half-breed leaders once he realized that the Northwest people were deeply committed to their resistance. The local people continued to grow stronger politically through the successes of their provisional government. In February 1870, the executive of the provisional government drew up a list of rights for negotiation with the federal government. The main points may be summarized as follows. The Northwest would enter Confederation as a province with the same rights as the other provinces. This province would be governed by a lieutenant governor, a Senate, and a legislature that would be elected. There would be 2 representatives in the Senate in Ottawa and 4 representatives in the House of Commons. This province would not be liable for any part of the public debt of the federal government. All properties, rights, and privileges presently held by the Northwest people would be respected by the federal government. There would be no direct taxation for the first 5 years. The local legislature would determine the qualifications of the members of Parliament. The transfer of the Hudson's Bay to Canada would be withheld where it interfered with the people's rights. The local legislature would have full control over public lands of the Northwest. Indian treaties would be made between the federal government and the Indian tribes. The cost of all public buildings, bridges, roads, and public works would be paid by the federal government. Both French and English would be official languages. All debts contracted by the provisional government in consequence of the illegal measures adopted by federal officials to bring about a civil war would be paid by the Dominion Treasury. Although this was not the final list of rights that resulted from negotiations with Ottawa, it nevertheless contained the basic points for the province of Manitoba's entry into Confederation. By June 1870, Ottawa had agreed to most of the points in the list as the basic principles for the new government. According to the federal government's promises, the people of Red River seemed to have gained most of the conditions they had been fighting for. The Red River people were to be given self-government rather than colonial status, and the provisional government was to remain in charge until the new governor arrived at Red River. Unfortunately for the Red River people, another plan was unfolding in Ottawa and London. At the same time that federal officials were negotiating with provisional government delegates and making generous promises, they were organizing a militant expedition to Red River. The imperial governments at Ottawa and London collaborated on this venture, London bearing the cost of 400 regular soldiers, and Ottawa the remainder of the military costs. On 15th July, the day Manitoba became a province, troops under Colonel G.J. Wolseley were already well on the way to Red River, ostensibly on a peace mission. Since Monseigneur Taché was worried about the military expedition under the command of Colonel Wolseley to secure the West, he was assured that this was merely a mission of peace, to prepare for the arrival of a new lieutenant governor to whom Riel could confer his authority. The American government, though, much more wide awake than the Bishop of St. Boniface, was not taken in by the Canadian cabinet's protestations of good faith. It recognized that the alleged peace mission contained nothing of perceptible value, and it refused point-blank to allow the expedition to cross American territory on its way to Red River. Riel and the provisional government were equally aware of the situation. General Lindsay, commander of Her Majesty's forces in British North America, had told him, Riel, that he was only moving the troops from one point to another. Riel, who knew from reports provided by the Indians and from his own scouts what was going on, wrote that he did not want to reply. So much naivete tired him. He knew that, while they were exchanging ideas, the troops were nearing the mouth of the Red River at Lake Winnipeg. Not only he, but other members of the council were well aware of the situation. insurrection. When Wolseley's forces finally arrived, Riel realized the resistance was futile. The democracy for which the people of the Northwest had struggled was shattered. Ottawa had already rejected several of the conditions previously agreed upon, and with the campaign complete and Red River occupied by federal troops, Ottawa installed its dominion over Manitoba. The People's Democratic government was crushed, and the Hudson's Bay Company was revised from its early feudal operation and brought into line with capitalist development. A reign of terror against the half-breeds followed in the wake of Colonel Wolseley and his troops. When they and the Orangemen had finished their violent destruction, the half-breeds were landless and homeless. They went up and down the country drunk with rage and alcohol. The Métis, not cautious enough to avoid them, were instantly insulted. A number of women and girls were molested. On November 30th, James Tanner, a Protestant half-breed, was killed with the least plausible pretext while leaving a political meeting at which he had spoken. In spite of the racial tumult that followed, Louis Riel's popularity remained high enough in Red River that in the 1871 federal elections, he was nominated for the district of St. Boniface. However, he allowed himself to be manipulated by Ottawa and Bishop Taché and surrendered his nomination to Étienne Cartier. After the death of Cartier the next year, Riel entered the election again. The federal government, fearful of Riel's victory, tried to bribe him. During the campaign that preceded this election, federal government agents offered him, Riel, $35,000 to retire from the contest and leave the country. Riel refused and was elected. Apparently, a Métis leader was politically dangerous, especially as a member of parliament. The execution of Thomas Scott, in which he had played no instrumental role, was now used against Riel. Ever since Scott's death, the Orangemen had been clamoring for justice, and a $5,000 reward had been offered for Riel's arrest. Despite this danger, Riel presented himself at the House of Commons in Ottawa and took the oath as a member of parliament. Riel's appearance in the House of Commons prompted a resolution to bar him on the grounds that he was wanted for murder. Even though it was legally his seat by virtue of the People's Democratic decision, the members of parliament voted almost unanimously to deny Riel his seat. Racism was apparently stronger than justice in the Canadian House of Commons. The vote scarred Canadian democracy and has doubtless caused some native persons to question its validity. This parliamentary decision leads one to wonder whether the electoral system will ever work for the Indians and Métis.